Hi everyone, welcome. We have two senior journalists with us to discuss the month's headlines. There's Hartosh Singh Bal, who is the political editor of The Caravan and is a journalist of repute, has strong views, as we all know. And there's Rajeev Khanna, who is based in Himachal Pradesh. He's written for a whole host of papers, writes for The Citizen as well, and has covered the farmers' movement, etc., very, very efficiently. So welcome both of you, and thanks for giving this time. It's going to be short and crisp, I hope. We are going to, as I told you, just discuss the month's headlines, which are the broad headlines, or the issues rather, which have concerned the media and which have concerned the people. Let's start with some of the latest ones, which is, of course, Punjab. We have the Congress and the First Family intervening. They summarily, literally forced Amrinder Singh, it seems, to resign, etc. So, Hartosh, will you speak on that? Talk about what really you think happened a little bit, and also we'll come to the media coverage of it eventually.
Look, for anybody who follows Punjab closely or knows the state, this was coming. Amrinder had lost his popularity. He was his countenance was posing a serious risk to the Congress's chances in the next elections. The question is, how was the transition to be managed? What kind of transition did it need to be? And it was clear Sidhu was the main contender because of the many issues on which action has not been taken by Amrinder or the Akalis before that. There is the question of drugs, there's a question of sacrilege, there's a question of corruption, illegal sand mining, all these issues. There's no perceptible difference. On the ground, there may be crackdown on dealers at the lower level, but in terms of the big faces, action, messaging through the police that we are serious about these issues never took place. Sidhu was the only person who was raising his voice. Sidhu is by no means the ideal successor to Amrinder, but he has far greater popularity. Now, this transition just was badly handled. The young Gandhis, I'm sorry, after all these years, they are illiterate in the art of politics. And it was, you decide to remove Amrinder, it has to be done quickly. You already have to have a transition plan in place. Simultaneously, you needed to announce the next leader. The next 2-3 days, the Congress bled. There was jockeying from perhaps one of the most appropriate candidates. Sunil Jakhar was passed over, alienated. He's angry. He feels Sidhu was the one who's slighted him. Randhawa again feels slighted, feels Sidhu is the man to blame. So Sidhu, while succeeding in removing Amrinder, has picked up more enemies. Channi was finally appointed, not as a master stroke, well thought out. It was the last option. They had to take refuge in the fact that Channi is a Dalit to sort of justify this. This is going to be difficult as we go ahead. Right now, it's clear that Sidhu is controlling many things from behind the scenes as PCC president, but Channi will not go along with this for very long. And when the time comes to fight the elections, are you going to cast aside your Dalit face to project Sidhu again? And what happens at that point of time? This was the Congress's election to lose, and I think they're trying very hard. The AAP, for once, is suddenly seeing a chance where I don't think any existed in some sense.
Right. So, Rajeev, you've been covering it at some length. This is going to increase factionalism in the Congress, right? And it has also come too close to the elections, assembly elections. So how do you see this panning out?
As you pointed out, it's all about the timing. You know, the timing was very crucial at this point of time. What kind of chief minister do you remove just 4 months before the election? That is not the right thing to do. And if at all Amrinder was not performing, like Hartosh rightly pointed out, there was enough time. He could have been removed midway. There would have been a smooth transition. But now all of a sudden, this whole drama turning out. And then you have people like, like Hartosh pointed out. Now, once Channi is in place, you can't just remove him. Even if you win the elections, you can't remove him easily, since he'll now be, contesting on the Dalit platform.
Hartosh, what about the media coverage of this whole thing? Do you think that it's been fairly fair and fairer than it is on other issues? Or do you think that the regional media and the Delhi media have had some kind of a discrepancy in the entire coverage of the situation and chaos?
Well, there is a discrepancy. That discrepancy, to be fair, is not the kind of discrepancy that sort of sits with the coverage of the BJP, where it is totally sort of manipulated or controlled by the party. This is a difference of perception of Punjab. People in Delhi do not get Punjab. Sidhu is seen as some kind of laughable figure. They can never understand. Amrinder is more acceptable. He seems well-spoken, English-speaking, okay on national security, one of the best faces of the Congress. So what actually he was being perceived as in Punjab was just lost on people in Delhi entirely. Senior political commentators had no idea what was evident to every regional journalist in Punjab. And I think this was evident in the reactions to what happened as well. So I think there was a huge disconnect, and disconnect is particularly strong as soon as Delhi starts reporting states which have strong regional identities of their own. Delhi does not get this. So the Hindi belt is easier to cover because, yes, there is a greater back and forth. Most of your reporters are drawn from the Hindi desk. UP, Bihar, MP, you will not make such mistakes. As soon as you get states with strong regional identities, which operate very differently from the Hindi belt, you get complete confusion even among so-called senior political journalists in Delhi. And this was obvious in the coverage.
Okay. So I'm going to move into Afghanistan and then hope that eventually your internet is okay, Rajeev. On Afghanistan also, Hartosh, I'll start with you. We have seen a real polarization, actually a global polarization of the media coverage on the Taliban, it's coming to power, what's happening inside. And there seems to be a sort of a narrative which is driving the coverage of atrocities, executions, women discrimination, which of course is there and will be there. But without recognizing the fact perhaps that the Taliban is at the moment a more restrained entity and it is not repeating what it did 20 years ago. What do you think?
Look, I think, Seema, one of the problems is that I'm not sure what to think. I can't commit to this view either because we don't have information coming out of
enough. Yes.
What is true is that I think the black and white portrayal is not easy to accommodate, not because I think the Taliban is not a problem. I think it's hugely a problem. Much of what is attributed to the Taliban is true, but what was happening under the previous regime outside Kabul was not being reported. I think there was a very good New Yorker article that described the plight of women under so-called Afghan rule, what was happening. I mean, the warlords push people into the hands of the Taliban. So I think while much of what is said about the Taliban is true, I do not see the Taliban as a reformed face. I don't think we are getting reportage from inside Afghanistan that lets us to believe that. We don't know what is happening among the Haqqani faction and the so-called moderate or diplomatic Taliban. We get differing results on that. So in that sense, the Taliban itself is to blame. It is frozen information. It is not allowing journalists to operate in the way we would expect them to operate. So if some of the perception is that things are awful in Afghanistan, I think we have no reason to believe otherwise. We should not be giving the Taliban a clean chit just because we don't know enough, because their past record certainly leads us to believe that they will be behaving in a certain fashion. That this fashion is not dramatically different from the kind of lives Afghans were leading under the so-called free state supported by the Americans. I think that realization needs to sink in. I think that's the more important part.
Yes, I think so too. And I think the nature of the beast, like you said, hasn't really changed, but the nature of the beast has been reflected in places outside Kabul. And Kabul was really the showcase to the world that, look, we are a civilized occupying power. Rajeev, what do you've been a reporter and you've worked with various papers, and you've always found that very little money is spent by the media houses, which have big money, on news gathering. And I know the situation today is different, but perhaps in the last few years, do you feel that the media houses could have covered Afghanistan at greater length, and particularly in greater depth, rather, particularly since a year ago, when the Americans had announced that they're definitely withdrawing?
You're very correct, Seema, but there's another thing to it also. One, they are not spending good money. And the other thing is, even the reporters who were there, people who had gone there working as freelancers, or from whom you could have had good stories, in-depth reportage, And then the thing is, our media, as you know, they want a particular line and a particular kind of story which fits into their narrative. They don't want to hear what actually is happening on the ground. That is a very big problem. I've talked to a couple of reporters over there at times. So what they said was, we would offer a story, which was very good story, maybe on the plight of women, children, the international agencies that were working there for, the betterment of the society, or the shortcomings or other things. But then the thing was, they would always, the channels here, and even publications, they would want a certain kind of story that would fit their narrative in context of what is happening, in India also, and the kind of things that would suit them, as well as others, the powers that be at various points of time. So that's another big problem that is over here. And of course, they had enough time, they have enough money. If they can, send people for events in US and maybe Australia or UK, why not to Afghanistan? That's the point I wanted to say.
Okay. So, of course, one big story which has sort of dominated the beginning of the month and right through is Pegasus and surveillance. Now, this is something I remember when we were crime reporters, which is decades ago, and just joined the profession. And I remember going into the police headquarters and some journalist and a cop who was friendly saying, oh, well, now your file has been opened, it's lying on the police commissioner's desk and somebody had seen it. So surveillance is something obviously all reporters have lived with in different forms or the other. What makes Pegasus, apart from the fact of the kind of invasion the invasive technology where it really takes over, is it very different from, does it change the policy of the state, Hartosh? I mean, are we looking at shift in policy with the use of this kind of technology acquired from a foreign source?
Well, first of all, I think, Seema, if you look at the nature of intrusion through Pegasus, I think it is totally wrong to compare it to the old phone tapping. This is an intrusion into every aspect of your life. There is a control over your mail, your camera, your chats, your personal interactions. It's probably on as a speaker when you are not on the phone. This is not just phone tapping, it is video tapping of your life completely. And it exceeds the kind of control governments have over individuals at any time in the past, however centralized the government. So this kind of intrusion leaves you open to, I mean, ordinary course, the privacy of our lives. There are many things that we live out which the government has no right to access and which it can control and lead to considerable degree of manipulation and harm. And I think that is the real problem here, and it is being done in a haphazard, random manner, which is not directed by one of our problems. That's an old problem. Our intelligence agencies have no parliamentary supervision. There is no accountability. We don't have a policy. They're free to run riot, and we have multiple agencies choosing to run riot. So you can see in the list of people who are tapped are people that you would expect are almost working for the government themselves, and they are also being tapped by the government, whether their contacts are being tapped or there's a second watch being kept that you have to watch the people who watch out for us as well. All that is evident in Pegasus. And I think this requires serious reconsideration. Unfortunately, the parallels that I think the public draws with old style tapping or NIV thing makes us business as usual, and we needn't worry about it. At some point or the other, the government will have the ability to do this to every citizen, and we will not have any checks in place.
Absolutely. And it's almost getting there. What do you think, Rajeev?
Very true, Seema. And one is just reminded of, when one goes through this Pegasus episode, one is just reminded of that Orwellian 1984. That's the time it's coming down to. And of course, as Hartosh pointed out, it's not just surveillance in terms of tapping or other things. The thing is, in places like Delhi or, certain journalists or certain intellectuals do know what the law says, what happens. But otherwise, the authorities can just hound anyone, in the smaller towns where people are not aware of what is actually happening. You can just, you can just get a phone call with people threatening you with all sorts of things. It's very difficult for people to, and they don't even know whom to approach for help in such kind of situation. So it's actually hounding the citizens in a very different kind of a way.
Right. And as Kapil Sibal, we heard him in the court saying that, the government, we just want the government to say that they have bought it and they have used it. And then if they haven't used it, then who's used it? Because it's so evil, if you use that word, that even every government should want to know which agencies brought it in, even if it's a private player, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay, so now as we were sort of going to wind up with all this, yesterday we all saw what happened in Assam. There was a large-scale eviction, so-called eviction. 5,000 Muslims were declared illegal, and they've been living there for decades. And I think what has really sent shock waves, but probably the whole incident is shocking, but what is really said is that video of that man carrying a camera and jumping on the chest of a small, thin, emaciated villager after he had been felled by the police, shot and beaten, and was lying motionless. So what does that say? I don't know whether this man was a journalist or just a hired photographer or a human being of any kind, but what does that say of the system, and what do you read into this, Hartosh? The fact that this man was jumping on him, the fact the video was taken, the fact that video came out, are all sort of connected, because now everything is being, and obviously the video was being taken from somebody standing on the same side as the police.
So one is quite clearly, we must not see the act of the photographer as an aberration. He was there as part of the extended apparatus of the administration. There is a Gujarat, the BJP government in charge. What we are witnessing or what we see there happening is the culmination, and we are seeing it across the country, of this huge process of dehumanizing. If you are Muslim, this tag of illegality, particularly in Assam, has been built in through a process that was first driven judicially. We had the court mandated NRC, then all the BJP RSS propaganda. I mean, contrasted with the fact that we yesterday or day before have the Pew report, I think Sampath reported in the Hindu, of how there is no evidence for large scale intrusion into India of migrants from across the border anywhere that shows up in any of our census data. As if there was any such thing, it would be showing up in large numbers. Yet this has become the bogey through which the various manifestations of an anti-Muslim rhetoric that has driven Modi's rise from 2002 onwards and has defined the BJP and RSS for far longer is now become part of ordinary citizens in this country, ordinary people. That cameraman was living out the fantasy of, I think, of a great number of ordinary people. And he had the power to do it, so he did.
And do you, staying with you, Hartosh, do you detect a silence in the media that is worrying? Or do you feel that this incident has been covered?
Well, it's been reported. I mean, in terms of describing the incident, we'll see enough on social media, etc., etc. But to acknowledge what it represents, to acknowledge the place where we have placed ourselves, it is not happening. And in that sense, the media continually fails us. To say that migrants are fleeing Delhi, great. But why are migrants fleeing Delhi? Who's responsible? The media fails us. Why does this incident happen? What is the background to it? It is not an aberration. It is systematic. It's systemic. It represents this government. The failure of the media to be able to say what is obvious, I think that is our great failure.
Right. Rajeev, on this.
Well, I fully agree with Hartosh on this thing. You see, we do have reportage of events like these, but we never get, the hows and whys, as we are told in journalism. You never get to hear the hows and whys, which media should be reporting. And this process, as you say, it's just, trying to be more loyal than the king. You have such kind of elements in the media. I don't know whether this guy was a journalist or not, but I tell you, in many such instances, when the police does go for anti-encroachment drives or things like these, there are people who work as stringers for various media houses who accompany them as photographers. And this is, it all started. I can go back to Gujarat, what used to happen over there, where, reporters and even photographers from the spot would call their editors. It's happened, right before my eyes. They would tell their editor that such a thing has happened. And the editor would say, report it at length. We want a big coverage or whatever. And the guy from the other side would say, ye anti-Hindu nahi ho jayega, ye anti-national nahi ho jayega. So this kind of thing that is happening over here. It's just, as Hartosh said, it's the culmination of a process which started maybe more than 2 decades back, but it's
It is.
taking very dangerous, forms. And it's really scary if these kind of things are, I've seen the social media. People are also justifying this kind of thing on the social media. It actually reflects the levels to which we have stooped as a society.
Okay, so the last one, Hartosh, do you feel, I mean, given this kind of atmosphere and environment which is getting, I mean, the messenger has always been under attack. It isn't as if it wasn't under attack 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's always been the reporter who has been the favorite whipping boy. And the whip depends. Sometimes they were shot dead, sometimes they were beaten, sometimes they were threatened. But now it's becoming more and more systematic, right? And how do journalists, I mean, how would a journalist function in this? Because there is fear, there's fear of all these sedition cases, of a detention, of threats. How do you sort of walk the straight and narrow line of professional journalism?
Look, Seema, while I do admit that things are worse for journalists than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, much worse. The fact is that we are not Turkey, we are not in Russia. There is, for a mainstream Delhi journalist, the kind of pressure that they face is indirect through ownership. Direct pressure, fear, jail has not happened to any great extent. You will find very difficult examples. You will find some sedition cases, but beyond that, no. So if we start worrying at this stage already, then we are giving up the battle. I don't think there is the so-called crackdown is serious enough for us to silence ourselves out of some great fear. So if we do this, we are failing in our jobs at this point of time. At some point or the other, if it exceeds the bounds of what we can deal with, those are different questions. That's a larger question for society to address. But right now, the norms within which we are operating still allow us to do journalism and express what we need to. That we are not doing it is our failure. It cannot just be put down to the government exerting pressure.
Absolutely, absolutely. You agree, obviously, Rajeev, right?
Yeah, I agree with it. And the thing is, we need to focus more on field reporting, which very few organizations are right now doing. There are very few reporters who actually go to the field on the ground. We need to do more and more of field reporting so that the actual truth comes out. Right now, what we have is perceptions, views. These are not the things. We need to have, more and more people on the ground, and people who are on the ground in smaller places, the Mufassal towns, they need to be given a voice to actually tell what is happening.
Okay, so now actually the last word, Hartosh. Is it, would you say that it's right to say that good journalism, or let's say, I don't like the word good and bad, but slightly more professional journalism, which wants to bring it out as it should, has been driven more and more to the digital space and less, obviously, in television and in print?
Well, that's largely true, but that comes with a huge peril, as Rajeev is. Digital does not have the resources to invest in large-scale reporting on the ground. What is happening is the government is controlling the reported narrative. All amount of opinion cannot counter that. So yes, it's being driven to the digital platforms, but it is also restricting the scope of what counts as journalism. There's a huge damage to journalism happening in this process.
Absolutely. That's so true. Well, thanks, guys. Thank you so much for giving this time.